Thank you very much for coming today and to join us at the Triple Helix panel, Broken Science Tackling the Irreproducibility Crisis. Before we start, I just wanted to mention a few housekeeping issues. So first of all, fire exits. There are 4 exits in this room, one just in front of me, one to the left, and 2 at either side of the room. And secondly, mobile phones, if you could please switch them off. So for the panel, the irreproducibility has been identified over the past few years as one of the most persistent issues facing life sciences research and science in general. However, views differ as to how significant this problem is, whether it's pertinent to call it a crisis, and to what are its most important causes and the potential solutions, and that is what we are about to discuss today. I would like to thank all the panelists for coming to Cambridge to Fisher Building and to agreeing to participate in this panel. Unfortunately, Professor Chambers was not able to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances related to the weather, but the rest of the panel is here. The moderator is going to introduce the rest of the panel, which is going to be moderated by Dr. Danny Kingsley. She is the head of scholarly communication at the University Library here at Cambridge. Her previous role was the executive officer of the Australian Open Access Support Group. She was also responsible for developing the content on the ACG website, including explainers, blogs, and general information about open access. She spent 4 years prior to this as the manager of scholarly communication and electronic publishing at the Australian National University. And she also worked as a science communicator for 15 years, including 2 years with ABC Science Online as a journalist for news in science. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dr. Danny Kingsley.
Thanks for coming, guys. It's a really impressive turnout, especially given the weather's so horrible today. Now, just in terms of housekeeping, if there is a fire alarm, as far as I know, that actually does mean there is a fire in the building, so it's best to leave. So there's a fire exit there and one there. And if you need to go to the bathrooms are actually on the way out, but probably not if there's a fire. Just hold on. Okay, so as you can probably tell, my accent gives me away as being Australian, but I was actually born in Cambridge. My father did his PhD here. And during that time I was born. And then went to Australia, and now I've come back. Welcome, we've just begun. So, but what we want to know first is who is here, who are you? So can you raise your hands if you are an undergrad student here at Cambridge? So a pretty big proportion of the group, great. And what about a postgrad? Ooh, an even split there almost. And what about a postdoc? Couple? What about actually somebody who's tenured? Oh, couple. Welcome. Great, that's good to know. That helps us know kind of where we need to pitch the event. So what we've got today, because Chris wasn't able to come, I'm going to give a little bit of a talk about that's not a good start, is it? Irreproducibility crisis, stuff that I normally talk about in my capacity as in Office of Scholarly Communication. Then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Natalie Debott, who's the Senior Editor of Nature. They're all in order, these people. The next person is Peter Lawrence, Professor Peter Lawrence, who's an Emeritus Scientist at the University of Cambridge. And then we've got at the end Dr. Christine Ferguson, who's a Chief Editor of PLOS Biology, PLOS standing for Public Library of Science Biology. So it's a mixture of people who are coming from the academy and people who are coming from the publishing background. Now, I know Alex just asked people to turn your devices off, but perhaps just turn them to silent. If you're a tweeter and you want to join in the Twitter conversation, the hashtag is #TH for the Triple Helix panel. And you can put questions to the hashtag if you wish, because I will be following it. So if you don't want to speak and ask a question, you can do that way. But we do also ask, if you are going to speak and ask questions, then you need to wait for the microphone to come, because even though people can hear you in the room, the recording will only pick up what goes in through the microphones. All right, so that's the introductory talk. So the way we're going to work is a quick introductory talk from each of the people, approximately 10 minutes each. Then we're going to have a short panel discussion amongst ourselves. Well, hopefully we've got something to talk about. And then we'll have a public discussion where we're really going to pull you into the conversation to talk about the sorts of things, questions you may have. And then as my understanding is, there was a drinks reception, which is probably why everybody turned up, but you have to listen to this first. Okay, so that's the hashtag and time for public discussion towards the end. So this is my bit. This is me not being Chris. This is me being Danny Kingsley. So one of the issues that is actually triggering one of the reasons why we have this problem now with the problem with reproducing research, let's call it that, is that we've got a rat race in the research game, and the rat race is the rat race for researchers to stay ahead. Those of you who have started this process will understand that it's very, very challenging, and the problem is that the only thing that counts in academia, despite all of the things that academia encompasses, is publication of novel results in a high-impact journal. And it doesn't matter what else you do. It doesn't matter how much fantastic data you produce. It doesn't matter what wonderful methodology or protocols you create. That does not count. The thing that counts is your name on an authorship of novel results in a high-impact journal, and that's all. And that causes huge numbers of problems. And so we're stuck because what it creates is really serious problems in the scientific endeavour. So when I normally talk about this, I'm giving a much bigger picture. And so today, all I'm going to talk about is reproducibility. But this is an idea about the sorts of issues that this insistence on the one outcome has actually produced in the endeavour of science. And it includes things like people being reluctant to share data, hyper-authorship. We had a paper, a physics paper, I think it was towards the end of May last year, that had 5,000 authors on it. That's hyper-authorship. Reproducibility, which is what I'm going to talk about today, retraction of papers that have been published. Please come in, we've only just started. Poor science as a result of this activity, and also the attrition of early career researchers out of the system because of the difficulties of the system. And this all comes back to this reliance on publication of novel results in high-impact journals. So let's talk about reproducibility. The problem is that scientists are very rarely rewarded for being right. They are rewarded for publishing in certain journals and for getting grants. And what that means is this is a description of the 9 circles of scientific hell, which, now what I'm doing at the moment is, despite being hands-free, I'm actually live tweeting. Isn't that magic, dark arts? I've scheduled some tweets, so I'm actually tweeting the links to all of these things that are coming up here as I speak. So if you follow the hashtag, remember, TTH panel, you can see what's going on. Anyway, 9 circles of scientific hell. And what these are is a description of the sorts of activities that go on, not all the time, but sometimes, in some disciplinary areas in relation to trying to ensure that you do create novel results. And they include things like, well, in bad cases, plagiarism, quite often non-publication, so if the results don't show what you were trying to show, then you just don't publish them. Partial publication, so cherry-picking the publication. Inventing data, it's a pretty bad one. But p-value fishing, so trying to find the results that actually provide you with the p-value. I'm already seeing some nodding in the room, by the way. P-value fishing to try and find the ones that actually support the hypothesis. Or you could just go straight to post hoc storytelling, which is do the experiment, look at the data, and then go, oh, I guess my hypothesis must have been, to ensure that your hypothesis is supported by the data that you have now produced. Things like overselling, or just being in limbo, in that you are not able to find novel results. This is a study that came out in a PLOS journal, PLOS Medicine, in my eyesight's so terrible. What was it, 2005, so it was a long time ago. And what this guy did was he said, let's have a look at how studies are actually structured, and what are the sorts of things that would make a research study more likely to be valid. And it's to do with the size of the study and the methodology used and the type of way that the participants might be recruited, and also things to do with the personal bias and so on of the people undertaking those studies. If you then have a description of what is likely to be a solid study and a description of what is likely to be not a solid study, and then you compare how lots of studies are actually constructed, unfortunately they fall very much in the not likely to be a solid study camp. And it was for that reason, he said that for most study designs and settings, it's more likely for a research claim to be false than to be true. It doesn't necessarily mean they are, but it does mean they're more likely to be. That's rather concerning. So, This is an issue in terms of reproducibility. It's more of an issue in certain disciplines than others, and one of those disciplines is psychology. And so this was a study that was done, or a project that was done through the Open Science Foundation, where they conducted replications of 100 experimental and correlation studies in psychology journals. And they said to groups of people, can you reproduce this? Can you do the study again, please, and reproduce the same conditions? Now, when it was replicated, there was a much bigger, it was very obvious that the way that the studies had been chosen to be presented in the first case was somewhat overselling, in that the 97% of the original studies, nearly all of them, had significant results. But when the studies were reproduced, only 36% had significant results. That would indicate that there is quite a serious problem, at least with those 100 studies. So Nature last year in May ran a survey, or they published the survey, they ran it before then, where they asked the research community if there was a reproducibility crisis. And so 1,500 plus researchers responded. And between them, when you actually add it together, 52% saying that there was a significant crisis and 38% saying a slight crisis. That's a bit like being a bit pregnant, by the way. Anyway, adds up to 90% of researchers do consider there to be some kind of crisis, which is a fairly large proportion. Interestingly, only 32% of the people responding in another question were saying that then meant that they felt that they couldn't trust the literature. So there is some oddness going on there in people's minds. If there is a reproducibility crisis, you would think that number were higher, but that was what came out. So really, we are in a position where it is time for change. And so this was a quote that came out of a blog by Richard Smith, who was the editor of the British Medical Journal for a long time and has written quite extensively on things like authorship. And what he's saying, that the whole system is kept alive because the fact that employers and funders of researchers assess researchers primarily by where they publish. And he said, and I support this argument, it's extraordinary to me and many others that the employers, which are mainly universities, outsource such an important function to an arbitrary and corrupt system. And by that he's partly talking about the publishing system. We have the publishers here who are able to talk about what they're doing to try and address these issues tonight. So the solution, well, I'm proposing that the solution to this issue, this is a solution not just to do with the reproducibility, but also with the other issues that I talked about very briefly earlier in terms of retractions and hyperauthorship and sharing data, is to actually distribute the dissemination across the research life cycle. Those 5,000 people who wrote that paper didn't write that paper. They did things like write software protocols, and they created data, and they did analysis, and some of them made the coffee. Like they were the people who contributed to the project. And the only way we have of crediting those people at the moment is to call them an author on a paper. So we really need to look at other ways of crediting this other activity that's part of the research process. And so if we were starting to credit a data set and making a data set available and putting a DOI against it, which is what we do in the University Repository, by the way, through the Office of Scholarly Communication. Come and talk to us. We're happy to get your data. And then it's able to be cited, and making your research protocols openly accessible prior to publication, and so on and so forth. If these things were the rewarded activities throughout the whole process, we would have a very different situation, because what we wouldn't be doing is relying on the endpoint. We would be able to assess as we go. And what that does is then it cleans up and makes transparent the whole process in a way that we can't make it transparent at the moment. So please feel free to join in the conversation. That's the hashtag TTH panel. And I'm now going to pass on to our next panellist, who is Dr. Nathalie Debott, who's the Senior Editor of Nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. This was really lovely, and I hope that I can show you today from some of the initiatives we have at Nature that we are trying to go along the lines of what Danny explained at the end, how to reward lots of different aspects of the scientific activities. So first, I'm one of the editors at Nature who takes care of the primary research papers which are submitted to the journal. Nature is divided in a way that we have a team of editors taking care of papers submitted, and we also have a team of writers, commenters, journalists who write all those interesting things you like to read in the first part of Nature about what's happening in science. And Danny already mentioned that very nice survey from Monia published last year, and she's one of those persons and has been working a lot on that issue of reproducibility. So I thought I would just start with our mission statement, which is from the 1870s, whenever that Nature enterprise started. And the whole idea here is that the journal is there to serve scientists through the publication of advances and to provide a forum for reporting and discussion, news and issues concerning science. And really, this is a mission statement which was drafted at a time where print was the only way of communicating science to wider public. But of course, nowadays, with the advance towards using digital medium, that can be the forum can be much more than the print version of Nature. And so some of the things that we are promoting and working towards developing use digital medium and to try to address the issue with reproducibility. One thing I always like to mention at the very beginning, because I think it is true that up to a certain time, and only recently people realized this was not the correct measure of the scientific activities through publication, but for many years the publication per se is the time where you show a state of your findings, but nevertheless it also means that once you write the publication, you also have to make available your materials, your data, your protocols very promptly so that people can build up on that research. And I think that is very important and crucial to addressing reproducibility issues. So I think Danny mentioned already how she envisioned what reproducibility means in the grand scheme of things. So one thing I would like to say first and foremost is that issues with reproducibility are not really issues about fraud. It's more about how we perform science, from designing the experiments to analyzing them and then writing a paper or disseminating them in another fashion than inventing them. So, of course, because of just the nature of the scientific enterprise, some conclusions are made at a given time from the observations. And as we go along and increase the knowledge, and perhaps there are some new technologies available, those conclusions may not stand anymore. And that also doesn't mean that there is an issue of reproducibility with the initial findings. There is also the fact that replicating a particular set of data is very different to generalizing to many, many other situations on the basis of this one observation. So in principle, reproducibility is just looking at that one particular conclusion. But of course, as Danny mentioned already, so issue of reproducibility will come up when there is cherry picking of some results, some uncontrolled experimental bias, some poor experimental design, statistical insignificance, or trying to fit the p-value, as she already mentioned, and perhaps the use of faulty reagents or not presenting the data as one should have thought about. So I think there are two things here to keep in mind, is that, first of all aspects of scientific communication, it being between the undergraduates or the graduate students doing experiments in the lab and then reporting them to their PI, the PI talking to their peers, talking to their funders, and writing papers. This is all based on trust. So we always assume that people are telling the truth at all stages, or what they perceive as the truth, but making an effort towards this. And the second thing to think about when trying to see how we can address the reproducibility issues is that this is a very big problem, and this is a problem that journals can help address, but they cannot really tackle it on their own. It's going to require a multi-pronged approach with initiatives, I think, from funders, scientists, of course, and journals can participate into this. And that is very important to understand, is that we can propose things to try to address the issue of reproducibility, but we won't be able to fix it without the help of scientists, I will say, and everyone else. So today what I will speak about very briefly are some of the tools we are offering scientists to be used when they do their research, when they prepare their papers, after publication to disseminate them, so that it helps address the irreproducibility issues. So the first thing we can do, and those are I would say, the articles everyone likes to read mostly because they can read it when they are outside their field too, is we can try to raise awareness and participate in the public debate. And those people I've mentioned at the beginning, who are writers, commenters, can help into this. So we have different collections of articles which have been written by some of our writers who have, and or some of our editors who have participated into public debate. So, for example, last year, the head of policy went to the NIH when there was a workshop on irreproducibility and discussed there with scientists and funders what can we do to address some of the issues. There is many papers you can look at. I wish I knew how to do this automatic tweeting, because I could have put up those papers for you. But I'm happy to share them with Dani afterwards so that she can have them. And so some of those pieces are written by editorial staff at Nature, but a lot of them are also written by scientists who care about those different problems which are linked to reproducibility. And this is a growing resource, so it's live on our website at all time. I have indicated the link here, and people are adding up to that collection, so if it's something of interest to you, you can read. So now I'll put my hat off the person who takes care of primary research papers submitted to the journal every day, and try to explain to you what we can do. So the idea here is to improve the reporting of the research findings to enhance their reproducibility per se. And I think there are two aspects which Dani has mentioned already. One is linked to the methodological details that people are using when they do their research, and how do you report them, and also how do you share the data, and how do you ensure that everything is there for others to see. But beyond providing tools for others to build up on the research finding, I would also say that I think that many of the things we can do as publishers is to provide recognition for the contribution of researchers working in large groups in a way that they are identifiable easily. And Dani also mentioned this issue with the, I forgot how many authors paper, 500 or something like this. So what can we do about this? So one thing is that we can ensure that in the publication per se, there is a meaningful contribution statement where it is very clear who did which type of experiment and which type of analysis. So those examples, you can see the progression from 2013 when we started to really try to have some kind of a statement written to what we will now consider a good statement, where it is very clear who had done all the different experiments. So anybody on the paper can say, use that as a recognition of their part of the work there. We also have implemented this tool, which is in a view of trying to, first of all, to improve the rigor and reliability in the reporting, but ultimately, we like to think that issues which are raised into the checklist, which people have to fill in at submission, will also help people think about designing their experiment in a way that their findings will be reproducible. So this checklist has been in place since May 2013, and it has a lot of, like 5 or 6 sections, I would say, but I mean, the widest part is linked to how do you describe your statistical approach. And this is very important, we think, because it is crucial that somehow one thinks about this before starting the experiments as well. So not only when you are doing the paper. So of course, perhaps the first time people come across that, they will look at this after the facts, but I have heard people telling me that they have now used that checklist when they are thinking about their experiment, which I think is very rewarding as an editor. Another thing we've promoted is the fact that one can use as many words as they want for their method section. And of course, in the time of print, this would be very difficult if you are limited in the term of how many pages you can afford to print, but in the digital age, it doesn't matter really. So that's a very good thing, that progress towards the digital age. We have re-emphasized the need for data sharing. So in some communities, this has been around for many, many years already. And so the public repository are very well recognized that one has to use. We have also developed together with scientific data, which is a new way of publishing results, quite linked to what Danny was saying about having an open platform to publish the data. So the scientific data publish data sets which are associated with published papers, but also data sets which are just submitted to them. And sometimes it can be some community-based work, somebody doing some survey into the ocean in some places in the planet. So they can describe the data set in that place, and it can be deposited in a public repository so that people can access it. And then finally, so that it is very clear how one has come to the conclusion presented in the paper, we've promoted very strongly, and in cases of animal experiment, we request this to be provided. The source data, which is basically the data you've used to make your graphs and in which animal variability will appear, is published alongside the paper, once again, using the fact that this can be done online. So also, this means that now method section in papers, as just an example, can have a statement about reproducibility per se. And I've put up this example because I think it's remarkable that those people have actually taken the trouble to explain how many independent times their experiments were reproduced in the laboratory. And this is where we think we should work towards. So basically, this is sort of summarizing what I said in terms of having clear experimental details. The checklist also asks for a clear description of reagents. And then the idea about having the data deposited clearly. I think I may run out of time, so I'll just, I'll just present this one because this is one of my pet subjects. I think because we could do those very nice histogram and bar graphs, when I was doing some lab work myself, I also used them. This is not really showing the beauty of your data. The beauty of your data is its distribution. So I think everyone should present their data as data points, not as histograms. And the policy at the moment is that we want people to do this when they have below 5 measurements, but I actually think we should do it for many, many more than this. And I hope that having the source data can help. So within Nature journals, Nature Methods have worked with a community of statisticians to develop some tools that biologists can use, and those are the places where one can find them. This is just how the checklist ends up in action. Basically, when you describe all the experiments in the figure legends, you can find very clearly everything that has been done, rather than having just one pretty picture. And then this is what I mentioned about having source data available so that you can do the link. One thing I'll just finish then afterwards, I think what we have to remember is that when you describe the methodology you've used, the devil is in the detail. This is a very nice commentary from Cornelia Poliak and Mina Bissell, whereby they figured out that when they were treating breast tissue, they had a very slight difference in the way they would prepare them in the way they agitate the tube, and that makes the whole difference in terms of what they had as a result. So to promote the fact that a methodology has to be very precise, we have this open resource, collaborative, it's free to post and read at any time, protocol exchange, and we sometimes request for papers where we know everyone is going to rush to their bench to try to repeat the experiment, that the protocol is deposited there, but I strongly encourage anyone to do it, and that doesn't have to be a Nature paper or a paper at all. This can be done at any time. And we also have a journal called Nature Protocol where, and this is very good for recognition as well, I think, is that somebody who has developed a protocol part of a bigger effort, and that protocol is very important for the community. They can write a paper where it's all explained and very practical, with a very, very practical focus. So I think I'll finish there. And sorry if I took too much time.
No,
Just wanted to.
Thanks very much, Natalie. So, Peter, do you want to? All right, great. So we've got Peter Lawrence now, and you are going to introduce yourself, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Okay.
I guess I'm here as a representative of the scientific working publishing community, the one who does the experiments and things. So I thought I would speak from that standpoint. I've been doing experimental research for 55 years, full-time, and so I have quite a bit of experience as a publisher. I've never had a group more than about 4 or 5. And I was an editor of quite a decent journal for 33 years as well, so I have a bit of experience in that branch of the woods. But I thought I would try to summarize and really underline and expand on what Danny Kingsley said to explain how I see where we started and how we've got into this mess. I want to briefly sketch out how measurement that began in the 80s grew like topsy and eventually became a barrier to original research and a driver of cheating in science. The measurement came in the 80s with Thatcherism and a sort of market economy that came from the Harvard Business School. And it spread everywhere from evaluating how good hospitals were by working out how quickly they answered the telephone, to ranking scientists by counting papers. It didn't quite get to ranking songwriters by the number of notes that they wrote, but it would be coming. Everything got more sophisticated and complicated, and before long we had impact factors, citation indices, H factors, and we had a huge growth in assessment techniques, and even a new and rather ghastly academic subject, bibliometrics. Now, in the old days, I started publishing in the mid-1960s. I published 80 of my refereed papers before the mid-80s, and I sent those papers to the journal I judged appropriate. Might be in a general interest thing, I thought people might be interested generally. I might send it to a general journal, or if it was a specialized thing, I sent it to a specialized journal. If it was a finding that could be summarized for the general reader, somebody who used to exist in those days, then I'd write a short note to Nature about that, and then a longer specialized paper about the same material. And looking back on those days is completely different from what people do now. Every one of the 80 papers I submitted before the mid-80s was accepted in the journal I sent it to. It's unbelievable now. Since then, since the mid-80s, it's been a very different story, with paper submission eating up a large fraction of everybody's time. Then the journal, as Danny pointed out, with its impact factor, became a measure of success, helped you land a job, was a ticket for a grant, chances of getting an invitation to a conference, etc. These papers became almost essential for survival as a scientist, and top journals therefore became overloaded with submissions, and selection became a complex and vulnerable process. The responsibility and power of selection moved, in the top journals especially, from reviewers to editors. In my early days as editor of development, it was the reviewers who really decided whether the paper should be published. But later on, increasingly, it became the editors. And I believe, I don't know what the latest figure is for Nature, but Natalie will know, approximately 90% of papers submitted to Nature are rejected before review. In other words, the editors make the statistically most important decision. So this has had big consequences for our scientists. So in my perspective, you have to persuade two different sets of people to take your paper. Firstly, you have to satisfy the editor. And for this, I believe, and this is my opinion, you need to keep in fashion. You often have to overstate the simplicity of your results. You should avoid complications and counter-evidence. And you should make nice, graspable generalizations. And even worse, you should avoid small fields and new things. That's how I see it. I'll explain a bit more. The result is that we're being rewarded for making things simpler than they are, for cutting corners, and for finding what people would like to find. And what people like to find determines the consensus. And the consensus in science has always been a very dangerous bedfellow. Science is not about consensus. Why do we have to avoid new things? This is how I see it. Because editors don't know about them. They don't have reviewers available to review in them. And above all, they worry about citations that they will get for those papers. Later in my editorial life, I discovered that I was being rated by what the number of citations were for the papers that I chose. And to do this, to solve the problem of getting more citations, you must choose papers that are in large fields and sort of half expected. An example of this is the history of CRISPR, which is very entertaining. Many of you will know what CRISPR is. It's the wonderful new genetic editing technique that will hopefully allow us to cure human genetic disease in living individuals. And it's very powerful. This came out of an obscure field of bacterial immunity. And one of the early workers on this was a Spanish guy called Mojica. And he thought it was important. He sent the paper to Nature. In November 2003, the journal rejected the paper without seeking external review. Inexplicably, the editor claimed the key idea was already known. In January 2004, the PNAS, Proceedings of National Academy of Science in Washington, decided the paper lacked sufficient novelty and importance to justify sending it out to review. Molecular biology and then nucleic acid research rejected the paper in turn. By now desperate and afraid of being scooped, Mojica sent the paper to Journal of Molecular Evolution. So it took more than 12 months from review to revision, and it was the first paper reporting CRISPR's likely function. Nowadays, we know CRISPR is the trendiest thing. And if you send a paper with a new CRISPR methodology, it'll get straight in, one likes to imagine, to the top journals. But the trouble is when you start new things, that's where there's a problem. So I've just said what the problem as I see it is getting past the editors. Your next problem is to get past the reviewers. And this is different. This leads to caution, keeping very consensual, doing political referencing, make sure you don't irritate anybody. And the best technique, I think, and if you look at the scientific literature, those of you who do will perhaps agree with me, the best technique to get papers in is what I call data overload. You dump data in the paper. You dump experiments, a huge number of them. You use different methodology. You bring in different pieces of experiment. And it's very difficult to reject them all. The reviewers put their hands up. And if you read modern papers, if you can read them, and for most parts I find them very difficult to read, they are stuffed with data. They're stuffed with complex statistical tests and careful hedging around. But what they often lack is clear, simplifying, original ideas. And they often, at least in the top journals, rarely deal with brand new, obscure things, most of which won't go anywhere, but some of which will turn out like CRISPR. Looking back on the discovery, one of the key discoveries in CRISPR, Emmanuelle Charpentier, when she was awarded, usually with Jennifer Doudna, but not always, one of the prizes, they get about a prize every week at the moment. She wrote, this was the Breakthrough Prize, which is worth about $1 million for each of them. She said the genetic editing technique which came out of what she called old microbiology. And she said that this project was a great example of a project that came about really through serendipity with a very little bit of grant support, to not follow the fashion, but to follow your curiosity and discover things you would not have expected. all their earlier papers were published in little journals and often rejected. So the result of all this is we're being eroded for not being original, for fitting in pieces of data like pieces into an almost complete jigsaw puzzle that others have made, for not questioning perceived opinion, and for sticking to busy, crowded fields. Now, I'm mentioning about not questioning perceived opinion. One has to be very careful, because most journals nowadays rely on 3 reviewers, and they expect 3 positive and even ecstatic reviews from the reviewers to get in, particularly the top journals. The chance of irritating one of the reviewers to a point where they'll lose their temper with you is very high if you try and criticize what's generally believed to be true. And therefore, it's very unwise to do this. Much better to hide your doubts in the text somewhere. So another way of putting all this, and I'm coming to an end now, is that we're encouraged to not be honest. And the proximate cause of dishonesty is that a scientist's purpose has changed from understanding nature or disease and explaining that understanding to readers to publishing papers in order to survive. And when your motivation comes to produce papers and to publish them in special journals, rather than discover and understand things, then this has a strong and deeply corrupting effect on the practice and quality of science. That's it.
The problem with all of this is it's really depressing. So when I started writing, you plug yourself in, yeah. When I started writing the blog series that I mentioned right at the end, I thought it was going to be one blog, and so I thought, oh, this will be fairly straightforward. And then it turned into 6, and as I was doing it, I just got more and more depressed, because I just thought, what's the point of all of this if everything's rubbish, if the whole endeavour is just broken? So it is very easy to take that negative stance, and we need to remember this isn't everything. It is actually a subset, but it is a serious issue that we need to address. So hopefully Christine will be able to talk about some of the ways that it is being addressed. So
yes,
off you go.
Thank you. Thanks, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this rather trendy topic at the minute. I don't know if many of you heard the BBC Radio Today program yesterday, where they were talking about just this issue, Mark Wolpert and folks from Cambridge, and so it's really a hot topic, so I'm delighted to be here. My name's Christine Ferguson. I've been an editor at PLOS for I think it's 10 years this month. I started as an associate editor, vetting the publications that came through the door, just like Natalie. And I'm now a joint chief editor of PLOS Biology, where I spend more time thinking about these issues of reproducibility. Well, I'm allowed to lift my head and think about these issues and to contribute to PLOS, which was really launched as a trying to get up your nose type of publisher in the publishing community. We've been publishing at PLOS since 2003. We publish 7 journals. We're a not-for-profit, fully open access publisher. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm proud to be here is that the reason we became a publisher is because not just to publish really good science or the best science we could, but to provide a compelling demonstration of the value and feasibility of open access publishing. So we really care about barriers to curiosity, barriers to sharing of knowledge, barriers to accessing that knowledge. And this is what drives us, as well as the whole scientific vetting endeavour. I wanted to focus on three ways in which PLOS has been addressing the reproducibility crisis. We've got quite a few things on the go, but just for to get some of the discussive juices flowing, I wanted to focus on 3. And they really address how much, the question of how much research investment is being used and how much is being wasted. And one of those aspects of how much has been not used is where data or metadata are not available to assess. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about our open data policy. There's publication bias, which many of the previous speakers have spoken about. People are trying their hardest to get access to limited research funds, so they're trying to showcase their very best, most exciting data, and that leads to cherry picking because you want to promote interest in your research and get those limited funds. And there are very few studies with negative results that are published or inconclusive results. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, say a word or two about scooped research and what we think about that at PLOS. So starting with open data, well, I don't think I really need to tell you about the value of open data. It's important to have data accessible in order to replicate studies, validate studies, better interpret studies, to include those studies in meta-studies, so knowing exactly how a study was done, the sex of the mice, the gender of the mice, etc., etc. You really need to be able to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges when you're doing big meta-studies. For example, stroke studies conducted in many different beasts with many different drugs. It's very hard to draw overriding conclusions for clinical application when they're not properly reported or missing important pieces. Facilitating reproducibility, as I've said, scrutiny post-publication. As an editor, I deal a lot with publication ethics issues. Many of them, I'm pleased to say, turn out to be unfounded and just, there was a worrying figure. But having the data to hand really helps dig into post-publication ethical issues. And obviously, the more available data is, the better return on research investment, the more it can be used. And potentially, one can tap unexpected things. So let me go back a bit. So since we launched in 2003, all of the PLOS journals requested that data was made available on request, on reasonable request. But it was very clear that studies conducted since have shown that it's clear that data availability drops off quite substantially as the years go by after publication. So I'm sure we've all done it. I'm sure I did it. You stick the replicate studies, all the information in your desk drawer, and it doesn't get reported, and someone sort of goes, but hang on, what kind of replicates did you do, and were there any outliers? And that sort of information gets stuck in the drawer, gathers dust, and eventually you toss it out when you move labs. So data availability falls off quite remarkably, and there are studies on this stuff that I can share with you if you want to see the evidence. And so because we felt that our kind of rather generic policy wasn't really being adhered to, we took to formulating a changed open data policy, and this came into place in March 2014, where we require authors to make all data underpinning the conclusions of an article to be released at the time of publication. So that meant, under this policy, every article is accompanied by a data availability statement. So the focus is on where the data is. There's a lot of confusion in the field about data. What is data? What do you mean by data when we ask authors for their underlying data? So, for example, if you have a graph showing single points and they're a median value of 5 replicate studies, we'd want to see all of the values of those 5 replicate studies in a table for every graph, so that people who come to replicate those studies can do so. So under this open data policy, we have every paper has a data availability statement and indicates where the underlying data are located, which repository. Is it on an institutional repository? Is it in an open repository like Dryad? And provides any information about exceptions. And there will be exceptions. So this is one of the ways we've been responding to the community is people say, oh, but I've got patient data. Surely, I can't allow that sort of information out to protect the identity and anonymity of our patients. That's fair enough. Other exceptions include things like if you have endangered species and you want to, there's data on where these can be found. Obviously, you don't want to publish that, else every poacher will be looking up these kind of maps. Precious fossils, all those sorts of things. So there are exceptions, and we're adding constantly to our list of exceptions, and there are things like committees being set up where requests can be put to those committees for certain aspects of data, and they manage the data accessibility of those exceptional data sets. Since the introduction of our open data policy, so it's been quite an uphill battle trying to mandate this and respond to the community's needs and to tweak that policy. And what we've seen is there have been clear increases in data availability. So since 2014, PLOS has published 66,000 articles with an associated data availability statement. In 2016, 4,000 data sets were deposited in open repositories. So now you guys have access to 4,000 more data sets than you did the previous year. What we've seen is engagement from academic editors and reviewers. So they're the ones who are going, these guys say that the data's open, but I clicked on that link and it's not working. And so there's much more engagement from academic editors and reviewers who are thinking about data and availability, which is great. It's trying to promote awareness of this problem. PLOS ONE has a question in their reviewer form that asks about data availability, and what we're seeing is much more engagement with reviewers who write things in there like, I don't know what you're talking about, the data here, or no, I can't seem to find it. And so even if they're engaging, rather, even if they're not putting down specifics about, the fullness of the data set or those sorts of specifics, we're engaging them, which is a great thing to see. What we've also shown with this open data policy is that publishers can influence the amount of data being made available to you guys as researchers. And this is part of the publication process. It reinforces standards set by many funders and by you guys. So we all have a part to play here. The second thing I wanted to touch on very briefly is publication bias and studies with negative results, as I've alluded to already. You want to get your most exciting data out there, and there isn't a lot of not only is there not a lot of incentive to do that, but there are very few journals that will publish negative data. As Peter alluded to, it doesn't attract huge citations. It's not going to build your profile as a journal if you think that way. But actually what we thought is we would like to provide a forum for being able to publish these sorts of pieces with negative, null, and inconclusive results. And so PLOS ONE actively called for papers that reported these kinds of findings. And we've had very little uptake, actually. I think there's a collection called Positively Negative, The Missing Pieces. And there are very few papers in there. That's been going since 2014. I mean, PLOS ONE publishes it's the largest publisher annually still, 25,000 papers a year. We have about 15 papers in the collection. So we can provide the forum for negative studies and these sorts of things, but basically it requires an engagement, not just from the publishers, but from you guys to put that data out there. You can imagine the conveniences to your fellow researchers, not having to repeat experiments that failed, or seeing where the negativity is, that you can focus on other areas, or seeing what approach doesn't work, trying something new. It's a save on resources, and it makes a lot of sense. So I encourage you, submit your negative data to PLOS ONE tomorrow. The third thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is scooped research. So everyone knows the pain of being scooped. And at PLOS Biology for several years, we've had a soft policy that we've kind of not really talked about much, except one-to-one with researchers. A study would come through the door and they say, we've just been scooped. This paper, we submitted back-to-back at competing journal X, and that paper got in and ours didn't. Or we've just finished this amazing study, and tried to, were ready to submit it, and 2 weeks ago something was published, and they're heartbroken. And what we've done is taken those papers and tried to assess whether they reach the journal criteria. So we also look for impactful studies at PLOS Biology, that's the journal I work on. And if it's a study we would have taken, if it's come to us within 6 months of publication of the original study, it's likely that the work was ongoing at the time of that original study. And we put a lot of value on those papers. We think that they're a valuable replication of an initial really exciting result. Oftentimes it's done better because people haven't rushed to get it out the door first. They've done the experiments a bit more carefully, so a bit more complete. And it's oftentimes in a complementary model system with slightly different approaches, but answering the same question. So it's an amazing validation of a really exciting result, and we think those are studies of value. So we're formalizing our policy, and I just wanted to flag that to you guys. We think they are really important replications of groundbreaking research findings. You have 6 months after the publication of the initial study to come to us. And so we're just going to make more of a song and dance about that. But PLOS One obviously doesn't put any emphasis at all on novelty, but as long as the science is rigorously conducted, they'll take it. So PLOS Biology is a bit more picky, but we definitely welcome scooped research if you feel your paper falls into this category. So I just wanted to end, because I'm hoping this will inspire a little bit of discussion with this slide, and that's really to try and explain what I think previous speakers have spoken about, and that is the need for all of us to engage in this problem of reproducibility. Publishers can do one thing. We need people to engage with us or to tell us that it's rubbish, and don't do that because it's not helping. And funders can do one thing, and they need to react to you guys too. So there needs to be a common cultural shift to break down these barriers to sharing and to improve reproducibility. So authors who are trying to put out their best work and are trying to hang on to their precious data so that they can milk it for all it's worth, they need to be incentivized to share their data. So if we take the example of data sharing, they need to be incentivized. And funders and reviewers need to really look beyond the first author publication as a measure of output of research from a group or an individual. They need to value data sets that are being produced. The postdoc that spends their 3 years developing an amazing technique gets a pittance of a publication compared to the person who then applies it and gets an amazing result. That's not fair. And I mean, the 3 years of work needs to be recognized, I would say. And likewise, publishers need to change the way authors, we can highlight things like data outputs and other research outputs. And as Natalie alluded to, there are lots of different ways we can do this. There are things like ORCID IDs, introducing those. I don't know if any of you guys know about ORCID IDs. This is a way of unambiguously identifying you as a researcher, being able to mine things like PubMed and add your publications to that unique ORCID ID. And then everybody, if you put that alongside your author name on a paper, people know who you are, can click on that link, it takes you to all of your research outputs. The other thing is more granularity for author contributions, which is another thing Natalie spoke about. We've just introduced credit taxonomy at PLOS. And so this is like 14 different types of contributions you could have towards a paper, data being one of them, writing the paper being the other. I don't think it's got making cups of tea there yet, but 14 sort of more obvious contributions. And those show up whenever you hover over an author's name online. And the idea is ultimately that credit taxonomy, they're working with Crossref to try and have it mineable as well, so it can be added to things like your ORCID ID. So there are lots of ways of flagging contributions to research, and publishers can play that role to raise the visibility to funders and reviewers who are assessing these things. They can ask for it in grant applications and value the data sets, as much value on data sets as the publication outputs. And hopefully that will provide some incentive for authors to share more. It's just a vicious circle, but I hope that we'll engage in some really exciting discussion after these introductory talks. So thanks very much.
Fantastic, that's great. Okay, so now we're opening up the floor. And we're opening up the floor, first of all, by me looking at my computer screen. So Alex, you're going to hand these around? All right, so while we're organising microphones, and if you do want to ask a question verbally, great, we've got somebody up the back already. Meanwhile, we've had a couple of things come through on the Twitter feed, and one of the questions was, would making peer review open help some of these problems? Do any of the panel have opinions on the idea of open peer review?
Sure, I can start. So it's something we've been considering, as I'm sure many publishers do. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. I think not many researchers are sold on this. They're very clear, they'd really like to identify reviewer 3 who always causes them grief. But I think when it comes to signing the review as reviewer 3, they're not so keen on that. And I think there's very real reason for that. They fear retribution from other reviewers, or perhaps the author will be the next person to assess their grant, and there'll be some kind of retribution, is one of the kinds of reasons. So I think there is real fear of open peer review. It's not straightforward. So I'll just start with putting that out there.
I can add to this. So I think, for example, in physics, people submit their paper to archive, and open peer review happens at that forum before you submit to a traditional journal, I would say. And that works very well. So there people comment and the paper gets better, or some flaws are identified. And actually, the commenters also suggest the appropriate journal to go to. So that's quite helpful for the researchers. And I think there's a lot of hope that this will happen in biology as well, with bioRxiv and other open archiving resources. But at the moment, people are not really commenting. So I think, once again, we need engagement from people to do it. And then, yes, perhaps that can move forward toward this. I think what's helpful, rather than, I would say, even peer review, open peer review per se, it will be helpful if we could indeed publish the review process as a whole. And some journals are doing it. I mean, Nature is not one of them, but Nature Communication is doing this. And I think that there will be a lot to gain from that, I think. And perhaps people will review it a little bit differently and try to address some of those issues that Peter mentioned, in terms of just growing the paper for the sake of growing it, because that's not what peer review is about. So that's a different matter to reproducibility.
But in practice, peer review often is driving growth. Very often, reviewers ask for more work. Sometimes they just think it would be rather fun if this author did this. And then frequently editors pick that up and say, you better do this. And some of these things can take a long time to do. And that grows the paper and diverts the researcher from doing something that they think is right to something which they're told to do. And so I think it's a bad thing. I know that eLife has brought in a policy that reviewers should not be asking authors to do extra work just for the sake of it. And I think it's a good policy. And I'd like to see that getting broader as a policy. It's not the job of reviewers to suggest various other things that the other hands could do that would be kind of fun or interesting, or would make the paper bigger or heavier. So that's a problem.
So in the audience, how many people have or are doing peer review? So it's a fairly small proportion at the moment. For those people who are or will be in the future, there's something called Publons where you can register your peer reviews. It's quite a good process because it means you can, one, keep track of the reviews that you've done, and it's a place that you can point to say this is the contribution I'm making to the community. And it also is a place where you can make your reviews open if you choose. I do quite a lot of reviewing. I always make mine open. I always tell the author who I am and ask them to contact me if they want any clarification. That's a personal choice of mine, it's not everybody's choice. But there are options now for that sort of thing, even if you're reviewing for a journal that doesn't itself require open peer review. So we had a question, have we got microphones in hands yet? Yep, great.
Hi. It's a question mainly for the publishers, and I hope I will try not to make it to sound too nasty. So most of the people here are postdocs and PhD, this is what it seems. And they all know, including me, that our next job, it actually depends on how many publications we are getting. In fact, I just had a job interview and they asked me how many publications you expect to have in the near future. And my question is, you're coming here and telling us to do better science, which is great. But what is the role of the journals? So, I mean, it seems that we are all part of a system that for us, will be very hard to change. But maybe if the publishers will make the system different, like in the way that they change the peer review system, maybe this is something that can make a change, because I've been a few days ago in a workshop on peer review, and the guy that gave the workshop emailed a lot of editors. How much time do you think every reviewer should spend on a paper? And they said on average 3 hours. This is not enough to tackle all these problems that we are facing here, and why the publishers are not doing something about it. Why are you relying on the reviewers and not making the reviewers, I don't know exactly what, but if Nature is publishing a paper that is bad, it's not only our problem, it's also Nature problem. So how are you going to solve it? Not just coming to us and tell us to do better science, but how are you going to be the firewall to prevent it?
Right, there you go, there's a challenge.
I'm not sure I understand the question. So, do you mean that are we providing the tools to ensure that reproducible science is published?
No, you're sending you get a paper to edit, and you send it to 3 reviewers, and you expect them to spend a certain amount of time, and in a way you benefit from it. But maybe this is not enough. These 3 hours that every reviewer gives for a paper, it's not enough to tackle all the problems that we are facing here. So maybe there should be something in addition to this peer review, to the 3 reviewers that every paper get. Maybe some internal review, the people that are expert and maybe being paid even, that they can tackle these problems. They can maybe try to reproduce the data or something like this.
Okay.
When you send a paper to researchers...
So I will say that, first of all, the way reviewers are chosen, it depends on the expertise you need to be covered for the paper. So you have to ensure that one reviewer is contacted for each aspect of the thing.
I mean, what you present here means that it's not enough. It's not enough that you have 3 reviewers that are experts. Maybe you need someone that will try to reproduce the data set. But then
well, so in some cases, when it is an extraordinary claim, we can ask some other researcher to reproduce the data set. But then how do you going to recognize the effort of those people? So if you want it as an independent reproduction, you cannot really make them author of the paper, because then they are vested. So you need to have another channel. Also, it's a lot of work, all of it, and at the end of the day, it's more important in that case, I would say, to sort of identify the key experiment that you think will need to be repeated. But you cannot do it for every experiment of the paper, because as I explained at the beginning, the idea is that the communication is based on trust. So the trust means that we assume that in the laboratories, people have taken steps to ensure that it is reproducible.
So, Natalie, there was a case, wasn't there? I remember this. It was about 2003, I think, there was a stem cell claim that was published in Nature, but it was published, what Nature had done was it actually did ask another...
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. That was a cloning for a monkey.
Yep.
Yes.
And you asked another group to actually reproduce the
Absolutely, yes.
paper, reproduce
Yes.
the research, and they were published in parallel.
In parallel, yes. So we have channels, and I've been considering doing this. It's just that in the cases where I have been taking care of, those papers have not yet come to fruition, I will say. But this has to be limited to extraordinary claim, I think, because otherwise it is quite difficult enterprise to ask people to do that. And also it's perhaps quite complex to do it in the time frame of the review process per se. So,
Yep, that's the other
yes.
problem. Yep. Would you like to go?
I've got a hello. I've got a simple question, and I would like to hear your comments on that. Again, regarding the peer review. So, what you would think of if the peer review would be firstly double-blind, so you don't know who the authors of this particular research.
Yes.
And you're also hidden as a reviewer, but then so you may be more honest in criticizing or addressing some of the things in this research or in your critics, but later once your review is out into the journal, the names of authors obviously and reviewers become known.
Okay, so I can comment on both points actually. So at all Nature journals, one can choose the double-blind peer review option. So if as an author you feel that it is important to you that the reviewers don't know who you are, you may choose that option. Not many people do, but a few do, and some papers have been published already going that route. So of course the editor knows who you are, because otherwise you cannot really communicate with a person and asking all those things that would be necessary. I think, it's very good. I'm very happy that it has wheeled to a positive outcome. One thing to consider is that the assumption is that people are going to be fairer and looking really at the science. My experience is that it's probably not always true, and quite the opposite can happen. So in fields where there are controversial ideas around, I think the reviewers ask for even many more experiments because they are very doubtful about it. Whether if it was a new idea from someone that they know the work of, perhaps, then they would not be asking this, But that's just my impression. So it's a problem, I think, for controversial fields that the peer review process becomes even more entangled in a sense. Regarding the name, this is possible at Nature at the moment. So since the beginning of 2016, I think, once the paper is accepted for publication, we ask authors whether they would like reviewers to be thanked for their work on the paper. And if the authors agree and then the reviewers agree, then we thank those people. So that also provides recognition for the peer review work in some sense. Of course, then in that case, you may you may have people thinking the way that Chris was mentioning, that they feel perhaps not comfortable having their name associated with a paper, and then somebody in the field who dislikes the paper will have to make a decision on a grant. So this is a little bit of an issue too, but that's for everyone to see. But the uptake has been quite good actually on people wanting to be named. So.
Well, I'm talking, probably not really clear here, I'm talking about combined approach. So firstly, you criticize research blindly, right? So the people know that you did it blindly. So you're not going into the personalities there. But then your name become disclosed, right?
Yes, that's what happened, actually. Yeah. Some papers which were double-blind, peer-reviewed, then was accepted and published, and so now the authors know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers, of course, knows who the authors are. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I ask of the audience, just quickly, how many people here are science-based people? And how many then, therefore, are humanities? Okay, so we are heavily science, because I'm just realising we are very heavy science in the group, what we're talking about, which some of this stuff is not actually relevant to the humanities because peer review operates slightly differently. But, sorry, so next questions.
Hi, is it working? Yeah. I just like to ask this to, I think, the man in the middle. I know, because your
That would be
comments
Professor
about-
Peter
your
Lawrence.
comments about Thatcherism were good. It's just you're talking about like the role of science changing from like moving from actually doing proper science and finding out new things to getting as many published papers as possible. I would probably believe that's the case, but have people actually done that much? Like, I mean, what was different in the past? Like, what made it work in the past and didn't work now? Or is it that you, in some way, you're deluding yourself and everybody's deluded that the past was a better place for science to be done? Because I think a lot of people now also just think, right, science was probably more fun in the past. Like, you could just go and, you could just mess about and you didn't have to care about this funding stuff. But that probably wasn't the case. But they're my thoughts, but
I think you're right. I mean, it was a lot more fun before, but that was partly because there wasn't such tremendous competition, and also because the scientific career wasn't so disastrously risky as it is now. A young scientist spends best part of 10 to 20 years in a complete state of insecurity. And it's a strange situation. So I know people who are over 40 who can't look beyond the 6 months in terms of their job. And the younger people working with them are in the same situation on short-term contracts. So that's one of the reasons why it's become so difficult and why it's become so essential to publish the papers, and why, since the measurement came in, people are trying to publish in the same journals, which means that Nature has to reject 95% of what they get. But they didn't in the old days. So it was the stress wasn't there. So that's part of the reasons why it's fun. And it was more fun. And that's what I've said, I believe, is just driving this dishonesty. I think there's a lot of dishonesty in science, and most of it's unsensational.
So I think like most people probably recognize this problem with it. So like, if most people probably recognize we have a stupid system in terms of rewarding people, how the fuck do we get out of it? Like, how do you go back to?
And you were asked about the journals, and I think the responsibility isn't really so much with them. In my opinion, the responsibility of changing things lies with those who provide the money, because they could change things. And to some extent, say the Wellcome Trust, which is a huge funder of science in this country, has begun to reduce, for example, the time taken on grant applications, which have become incredibly bureaucratic and took if anybody has a grant for 5 years, generally speaking, they spend the last 2 years of that full time trying to get the next grant or a job or something. So they can't concentrate on their work. And they could change that a bit by making grant applications much less and by not paying so much attention to where people have published stuff. Yes. And even though many of them say they're trying not to do that, for example, the universities have this assessment system, the REF system, which is supposed now not to pay attention to where papers were published. The trouble is, it's very difficult to substitute for that once you've got it in, because it all looks so precise. So, but I do think that that's where the changes could come from. The grant-giving bodies, the government bodies, and everyone else realizing that measurement has been specious. The trouble is, it's a very hard thing to do, because we're run by politicians who almost none of whom understand the scientific method, most of whom are incapable of rational thought and evidence and argument. And so it's very difficult to persuade them to see that actually, if you want to fund research, there is no simple way of working out whether it's going to succeed. There is no way of working out that, say, Mulstass-Charles discovery in a funded laboratory where you didn't have to write grant applications in 1987 should lead to a product or products which yielded $58 billion this year, monoclonal antibodies. There's no way to predict that. And at the time when the discovery was made, a special body made by the government to work out future financial potential decided there was no money in it. Just illustrating how impossible it is. So if they could take that out, this horrible impact statement that we have to write, if they could take that out from the calculation and understand that research is a gamble and that new things should be tried, and peer review it is not a way of working out whether something will work or not. It's just a way of collecting a lot of bullshit and trying to measure it. Then that could make a difference. So to make changes, I think the journals can't really be blamed. They're subject to huge pressures of selection. It's very hard for them to make the right selections. They make masses of mistakes. It's almost inevitable. We just have to accept that's the way things are. You can't say when somebody writes a new song whether it'll be a hit or not. Nobody says they can do that. But in science, we're being asked to do that all the time. It's just mad. But that's what they have to do. Wellcome Trust beginning, and NIH, Howard Hughes, Max Planck, anyone who's got independence could change things. And I think they should make a bigger effort to do so. But there's a problem. The people who are deciding, who have the power to change things, are the ones who've done very well under the present system. They're the ones who worked it extremely well and got into positions of power. They're the ones who are yielding power in this country, for example.
Well,
they're not the ones who've done lots of research for all their lives. They're the ones who moved into politics quite young.
Well, also the people who are powerful in universities are also people who've done well out of the system.
Exactly.
And so it's very hard to make change at an institutional level as well, because there is that problem that both the institution, like Cambridge, has done very well from the current system. We have our reputation because we have managed to succeed in the current system. So if we start talking about changing the way we assess research, that potentially puts the institution at risk. And so there's not necessarily a great incentive for us to go down that path. So we do have to be aware of the politics here. There are some good things though, and the Wellcome Trust has started, they're really pushing the open research agenda. They've recently launched Wellcome Open Research, which is a publishing platform for Wellcome funded researchers to publish all other sorts of material, including data sets and null results or whatever they feel, with an attempt to try and encourage more sharing of information throughout the research process. The NIH is now considering preprints being part of what you can put down as your sort of prepublication in grant applications as well. So it's not just final published results, it's also preprints. And Archive, which was referred to before, is a preprint service, the first one. So do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to add to that and say the Gates Foundation seem to get it as well, and they got nothing to lose, but it's amazing. They have mandated that any research from 2017 has to be published under a CC BY license, and they have nothing to lose by it. That the CC BY license is very important because it allows reuse of data for commercial and non-commercial uses, and allows full open access to that data. So I think they're doing wonderful things, and they've got a whole body within the Gates Foundation that pays for the publication fees, because things cost to publish. It does cost to publish, as you've probably heard some of that discussion as well. How much does it cost to publish an article? It's not for free. Someone has to publish it. It's just making sure that the money moves in the system in the right way. So coming back to funders, I think it's really important that the funders get behind these big initiatives. And the Gates Foundation have done that. They've also just, so that was in January, I think it got announced. And then in February, they've worked out to be able to pay for papers to be published in science journals, completely freely accessible under a CC BY license, and that's for a year. So watch that space and see what happens after that. Perhaps science will publish more open access than they have been doing currently. It's great news.
So I could talk to you for a long time about that, but there are other hands floating around in the room. So yes, bloke up back first, and then this guy here.
I wanted to get back to the peer review. I think we all recognise that peer review is a critical component of the publication process that sort of is designed to keep out poor and flawed science. But right now, it all depends on voluntary contribution from people who are incredibly busy to write their own papers and do their own experiments. And the recognition that you get for peer review, even though there's poublons or you get credits in some statement, is just not nearly as great as publishing your own paper. So as a consequence of the ever-increasing pressure of more and more journals, more people publishing more things, there is more and more demands on reviewers. The papers get more and more complex. So as a recognized reviewer, you get swamped with lots of invitations to review, and many of these reviews cannot be done in 3 hours. So it takes a lot of time, and you don't get any recognition for that. And I think that was your point. Is it possible for journals to establish a professional peer review? So Nature obviously has professional editors. Is it possible to have professional reviewers whose job it is to evaluate the scientific claims of papers, and at what cost would they come? It might be feasible for big and rich journals like PLOS and Nature, but it may not be possible for smaller journals. And what are the problems of having a professional peer review system?
I think one of the problems is you lose independence, because those people are doing it for money. So I think that can be one of the problems. I understand that there are many, many demands, and it's a lot of work. And I actually do hope people spend more than 3 hours, because I do spend more than 3 hours per paper myself. So I would expect that people will, respond to that and go into much more details, because I cannot understand some of the techniques in the paper, even if I spend that time. Yes, I don't think paying is an option per se, and as you say, it would be a problem at the wider level of not having enough money for that anyway. I think the idea is altruistic, and the fact that you think as a reviewer, you participate into the scientific enterprise as well by looking at the papers and helping others to ensure that what they publish is technically solid. That's the only thing I can say, unfortunately. And part of having the names there is part of trying to recognize this, and we hope that some other than people outside who are going to look into the evolution of people's career can use that. And you can also ask that a statement that you've been reviewed for such journals at some different places as well, I think. So that's for the funders, again, to move towards the recognition of that as a part of the scientific enterprise, I would say.
Hi, I'm a postdoc at the LMB. So I think we can't really put all the blame to the journals, and I believe that you're doing your best to improve things. I think I want to approach the reproducibility issue from a maybe broader, from an alternative, and maybe from a darker point of view, which is the fact that I believe that science is actually selfish. Science doesn't care about individuals. Science cares about the truth. And I believe that science is self-correcting. Maybe for a paper that is wrong, it will take 5 years or 10 years for people to prove that it was wrong. Maybe it will cost millions of pounds, and maybe it will end careers of many people, but the truth will be out there. So I think the best we can do is to improve this process, but maybe it's the science itself that should be blamed, and maybe that's actually the way it works, the things work. I'm not expecting any comments. It was just a
I think part of what I said about the conclusions are made with the observation at a certain time, and they may evolve, is part of what you are saying as well. So we have to just acknowledge that with what we know at that time, and with everyone has done their best, that's the conclusion we're making, but it may not be correct later on. I also think that, I agree completely with Danny that it's very easy to be very negative, but there are a lot of positive things coming out still, and a lot of things are moving forward and have been reproduced by others, have been moved to the next stage. So we also have to acknowledge that, and perhaps it is the nature of the beast that, as you said, not all of it can be pursued. So.
Now, we've still got some hands up. I'm conscious that we have now, from the starting point, been gone for an hour and a half. Please feel free if you wish to leave at this point. It's fine. I think we're happy to talk for another 10 minutes or so, but clearly we did advertise it was going to go for an hour and a half, and it already has. So don't feel embarrassed or anything. If you need to go, just go. So who's got the mic now? Where are we up to? Yep, Alex, yeah. Yep, the man at the front, yep.
I just wanted to make a comment that I'm not from the science community. I'm a complete outsider, but I like to come to events like this wherever I can to try and get a better understanding of what's going on in the scientific community. You know, to share the comment that I've got on this particular issue, it seems to be that there's a misunderstanding of the scientific method, and that, you know, negative results are actually positively contributing to the process of discovery. And one thing that I notice is that there seems to be very little engagement with the general public, and only by sort of getting people to understand what the scientific method is, can people get interested in funding it and getting involved with it. And you know, the more and more that we see people sensationalizing, you know, preliminary studies with, you know, small data sets and so on and so forth, the more it makes people think that all science is about, and all successful science is about producing the positives. So yeah, I just wanted to share that comment, really. And you know, anything that the community can do to continue engaging with the public and getting them interested in, you know, the actual method itself, I think is positive. So thanks.
I think that's a good point. I think one of the problems we have is that we are to some extent being asked to produce something for the public, and the vision that many publicists have is we have to make promises which we can't actually meet. And if we go on doing that, I mean, ICRF, for example, for many years had press releases frequently, and you heard them often on Radio 4. You know, there's been another great discovery that's going to lead possibly to the curing of cancer. And we have a lot of those. And the public, I think, are getting a little tired. Yet, nevertheless, we are being asked to engage with the public. And the way people think we have to engage with the public is to make these claims. And I think we're selling our own selves down the river by doing it. And yet we feel we have to. And increasingly the grant bodies are asking us to be involved in public engagement, but without really understanding what it could be. And it sort of comes down, unfortunately, though, to deeper education, that schools and things, and understanding scientific argument, and also the undervaluation of what's been achieved by science. It's just incredible when you think about it. I don't know whether you saw the film or the play, The Madness of King George III, which was about basically medicine in the 18th century, and its effect on King George, who had porphyria, and all the methods they used to try and cure him then. And if you look at politics and social life and culture in that period as portrayed in that story, and compare it with nowadays, the only tangible difference, the only real change, is that we've come to understand what porphyria is and we can cure that. But the other things, the politics and the culture, are just every bit as bad as they were then. So in essence, the reason why most of you are alive and why your parents can look forward to the survival of most of their children is the scientific method that you refer to. And the gratitude for that and the appreciation of the tremendous role science has played in the building up of sophisticated societies has been very much undersold. And scientists are often seen as some kind of monsters. And that side of education needs a lot more improvement. I mean, it's just incredible when you think of the diseases that we all used to get and how children died, and perinatal death and all that was, I mean, these things just taken for granted, but they're so fundamental.
Hi, I have a question for the panel. So if scientists have to publish a lot of papers in high-impact journal to then get big grants, how can we change the criteria for us giving grants if we move forwards from what we are doing now with number of papers, impact factors, H index, and so on? So what are the new criteria that new projects should be founded on?
Honesty. We need a lot more of it and less politics. The question is how to bring it back.
I mean, I think the fact that funders are looking at where things are published is something that need to change and could be easily changed. You can see it in looking at different parts of things like publication of data sets or methods which are important. That's one thing, but it's still linked to publication. Also, perhaps asking more your peers what the contributions of this person is, and sort of really trying to move forward from this quantitative measurement that people are trying to do to a more qualitative what this person is bringing to the scientific enterprise in this particular field. And changing the way you phrase it when you are looking at giving grants or giving jobs, that's what I think will be done. But one problem, and I think we haven't really mentioned this because that's not really linked to reproducibility per se in any case, but the thing is that when Peter Lawrence started, there were not many of us. There are many, many more now. And it's because the way the system works that as a PI, you may train, I have no clue how many PIs, how many graduate students, but even if you keep your small lab, your lab small, which I think is very reasonable and should be done, but it's not the case, you end up having perhaps in 30 years of career, you have trained, I don't know how many graduate students, but there is no space for all those people. So I think a way of valorizing what you are as a scientist so that you can move to other spheres of the society as well, that needs to be done, and perhaps then people will not attach too much of an importance of where their thing is published, if ultimately what's important is that they have done good work, and that good work will allow them to find a job in another sphere as well if they wish to.
Right, we might make this the last question.
So maybe quite a specific question. So I work in psychology, and what I see every week in talks and almost every day in papers is that initially someone does an experiment and it doesn't work, so they tease apart the data and they look at subgroups and they reflect their data as a proportion of the baseline, and essentially, you know, someone spent a lot of time doing research, so they want it to work, so they keep manipulating the data until they find something that does work, and then they say, oh well, as predicted, blah blah blah. So I just wondered, particularly as journals, are you doing anything to try and prevent that sort of data manipulation?
I think if Chris James had been here, he might have told you about registered reports, which is, I guess you know about it, you're nodding furiously, but it's a, for those of you who don't, it's a way of trying to start with a hypothesis that you're going to, a protocol that you're going to, or a study, and you register it before, so you write down how you plan your project, how you're going to power it, and that is what gets peer reviewed. And so before you even begin the work, you get the best feedback, and that gets published as well. Or I'm not sure if it gets published. This is where Chris would be better.
Deposited, but
it gets deposited, and then the person does the study, and then when that study is complete, you publish the initial proposal alongside the data. And so again, it stops things like negative data being buried or cherry picking and that sort of thing. So I think that is a very positive contribution, and Vicky said something like 44 journals have signed up to that. Yes. It's very new, but I think it's catching fire. Yes.
But the idea is there, it's like a clinical trial. It's like a clinical trial. For a clinical trial, you will do that as well. But of course, I think it's a great idea. I think it works only for a specific type of study. So because for this exploratory type of science that, I think Peter is in love with, it's not going to work because you don't know what you're going to find. So this is really more in terms of setting up like a survey, basically, but using a scientific method. So it's exactly as you would do for a clinical trial, which has also to be registered before, and it's decided what are the outcomes you're going to measure. So it's a good move for a certain type of studies, but maybe not applicable always. But in your field, definitely, I think that can help.
So that takes us up to pretty much time. The thing that is really important here is that you are here. I cannot overemphasise this, that this is the sort of thing that I do on a daily basis. The Office of Scholarly Communication at the university is here to look at issues to do with the dissemination and evaluation of research. That's our job. Partly what we do is run the open access program. We have huge funds from funding bodies to pay for open access, and that's part of what we do in research data management. But another part is we do talk to our research community about these broader issues relating to scholarly communication and the ecosystem that surrounds research endeavour. And what we're finding is we've got in Cambridge a really engaged group of early career researchers who really want to know about this stuff and really want to try and be involved in being part of the solution. And that's the thing. You can sit back and go, oh, well, I'll just continue on playing the game the way it's always been played. And that may or may not be successful, but ultimately it's not going to be the way we want to achieve what we want to achieve, which is trying to do the research for the greater good of mankind, for the environment, for society, and so on and so forth. So you guys are the future, and you guys came, you've listened, hopefully you've absorbed some information. You might go out and start doing a little bit more of your own investigation. If you follow the hashtag TTHpanel, I've been tweeting a lot throughout. There's lots of links to things that have been discussed throughout today, so that you could be a resource. The Office of Scholarly Communications is always here to help. So it's up to you guys, you're the future. So thanks so much for coming, thank our panel, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much once again for coming today. I just wanted to say that the panel was recorded, and you will be able to access the recording sometime after the panel, including both the slides and the Q&A session. Thank you very much, and there is also the reception in the foyer.
Oh, sure.